Kuwaiti initiatives on Syria. The state of Kuwait has always been a pioneer in its generous assistance to Arab and Islamic countries, reflecting the wisdom of the Kuwaiti leadership and people. Hosting the second international conference of donors in support of the humanitarian situation in Syria and the state of Kuwait reflects the strong sense of human compassion and keenness to support the Syrian people, as well as His Highness the Amir Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah and the Kuwaiti people's dedication and eagerness for charitable work. On January 30th, His Highness the Amir Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah inaugurated the International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria with the participation of 59 countries. The conference also witnessed the participation of 13 organizations and humanitarian and relief agencies of the United Nations. The conference comes in response to the UN Secretary-General's call last December to Kuwait to host such an event, which was highly welcomed by His Highness the Amir. The aim of the conference is to lessen the suffering of the Syrian people in and out of the country. The United Nations announced in December that its specialized agencies need $1.5 billion to provide adequate funding until next June to help with the implementation of its humanitarian program for Syria. Meanwhile, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon expressed his satisfaction towards the high level of participation in the conference and called upon all countries that had previously met humanitarian appeals for Syria. Therefore, about 60 countries participated in the conference and 4 organizations, the GCC, OIC, Arab League and the EU, in addition to representatives of civil societies and charitable organizations, illustrating the international community's support for the Syrian people. The UN Secretary-General said that the aim of the conference is to get pledges of not less than $1.5 billion to meet the humanitarian needs over the next 6 months until the end of June. The UN presented a list of 4 million Syrians affected by the crisis, in addition to more than 700,000 refugees hosted in several neighboring countries, including Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. For his part, Information Minister and Minister of State for Youth Affairs Sheikh Salman Sabah Salim Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah said the International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria reflected Kuwait's leading international role in backing the international community's humanitarian-related efforts. The state of Kuwait's organization for this conference stemmed from the humanitarian role it enjoys and its involvement in repeated humanitarian initiatives aimed at supporting the international community either directly or indirectly. Sheikh Salman said the pledging conference was held amid difficult humanitarian conditions facing the Syrian people in and outside their country. His Highness the Amir Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah's response to the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's call to host the conference is a clear evidence that Kuwait enjoys a leading international humanitarian and democratic status, as well as its keenness to support all relief efforts. Sheikh Salman hoped that all international efforts end the Syrian conflict as soon as possible and commended the $182 million in pledges of the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, made at the opening of the conference and expressed confidence that the pledging conference would succeed in mobilizing the $1.5 billion needed for the Syrian refugees. Earlier in December 2013, during the meetings of the 33rd GCC summit held in Kuwait, GCC leaders praised Kuwait's hosting of the first international humanitarian pledging conference for Syria. The initiative of His Highness the Amir Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah was received by national and international welcome due to its great importance as the Syrian people suffer very complicated living circumstances due to the fight between the Syrian regime and armed opposition. The conflict caused destruction and depleted resources and lives and hence required great efforts to relieve the Syrian children and women. The High Council of the GCC leaders expressed its appreciation for the response of the state of Kuwait to hold the conference. For his part, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon expressed his gratitude to Kuwait for its approval of hosting the pledging conference and for providing humanitarian assistance to accommodate the needs of the Syrian people. The Kuwaiti initiative of hosting the International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria is part of a ring of continuous chain of humanitarian works performed by the State of Kuwait for the interest of its Arab and Muslim brothers. His Highness the Amir Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah said in a speech at the opening of the summit that since the start of the Syrian crisis 22 months ago, Kuwait's aid had never stopped, neither on the official nor on the popular level. The first international humanitarian pledging conference, for which Kuwait had finalized all preparations, was the beginning of a series of following conferences for aiding the Syrian people until security and stability is restored in the country and the Syrians take back their position and draw in common Arab work. His Highness Sheikh Sabah added that the state of Kuwait anticipated the success of the conference and shall be glad to have it achieve all its objectives and provide the Syrians with enough support and aid to assist them against severe cold and bitter hunger. His Highness stressed that his ultimate happiness will be fulfilled when the crisis comes to an end and when the efforts of the UN Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi succeed in reaching a peaceful solution to avoid the killing of the Syrian people and the destruction of their country. His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah noted that Kuwait's hosting of this important meeting comes as a result of cooperation and coordination with the United Nations and a response to a valued initiative put forward by His Excellency the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. The support is stemmed of Kuwait's belief of the need to contribute to international efforts and exerted to tackle challenges that threaten global stability and destabilize the economic and social conditions in numerous countries of the world. As the situation in Syria deteriorated, the UN chief acted swiftly to resolve the crisis by appointing former Secretary-General Kofi Annan and then Lakhdar Brahimi as his senior representatives to reach out to all different Syrian parties and influential regional countries. And because of the importance and significance of the Syrian cause, the Arab League also chose to have the two men as their representatives to the matter. His Highness the Amir expressed his deep regret to the lack of success of all their sincere efforts, ideas and plans, which if approved would have stopped the suffering and pain of the Syrian people and the escalation of the violence. The GCC conference was being held at a time when the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria was increasing, the number of deaths was multiplying, and the destruction has become the main feature of every neighborhood in Syria without exception. The alarming reports, the terrifying numbers, and the documented facts that were reported by specialized international agencies, which we follow with total sadness and sorrow, give us reasons to fear for the future, security, and the territorial integrity of Syria and its brotherly people, as well as for the security and stability of the region. His Highness Sheikh Sabah said Kuwait and its leadership and people were terrified by the latest reports of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which confirmed that more than 60,000 innocent victims of men, women and children have fallen dead, and that the numbers of missing persons, detainees and injured have multiplied, reaching several hundreds thousands, in addition to more than 600,000 refugees in the neighboring countries who are suffering tragic living conditions under harsh weather conditions. His Highness the Amir praised the efforts exerted by the countries hosting the refugees, namely Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey and Iraq, and for providing enormous humanitarian and relief services to the refugees. Moreover, he commended the great efforts exerted by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as well as the other international organizations and agencies that are active in the field, which all fall within the humanitarian and noble framework of the UN organization and its international agencies that are specialized in this field. However, the great impact of the disaster requires a unified and integrated international effort, as well as the coordination of the humanitarian aid provision delivered inside and outside Syria that will fulfill their basic needs of shelter, food and clothing. His Highness Sheikh Sabah added that the contents of the latest report of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization about the situation of the agricultural sector in Syria underscore the gravity of the disaster, which confirms that the infrastructure of the agricultural sector in Syria had suffered great damage, and its restoration will necessitate a great deal of time and effort, noting that Syria's production of wheat has fallen to less than 50% and that farmers there are unable to harvest the remainder of their crops due to the lack of security and exhaustion of fuel. This doubles the humanitarian tragedy and deprives these farmers from their livelihood. His Highness emphasized that the facts and figures place huge responsibilities on our shoulders and prompt us to work with the utmost ability possible to confront this disaster, to rush to prevent the bloodshed of our brothers, and to preserve whatever is left of the country's infrastructure. This humanitarian tragedy, along with the alarming facts and painful conditions that are continuing, is a result of the regime's disregard of the just demand of the people and its refusal to accept regional and international initiatives that seek to end this tragedy. What also multiplies the suffering of the Syrian people is that there are no initiatives to stop the bloodshed and put an end to the sorrow of the displaced people. His Highness the Amir went on to say that the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, which is the body commissioned with the conservation of international peace and security, is required almost 2 years since the beginning of this crisis to hurry to unite ranks and overcome obstacles to find a quick solution for the tragedy. As a result, the state of Kuwait and GCC members appealed to the members of the Security Council to keep in mind the daily suffering of the Syrian people and the painful conditions of the refugees while discussing the developments of the tragedy, and put any other considerations aside when making their decisions. Over and above the distinctive and vital role of the United Nations and its various agencies, programs and funds, and with all the international humanitarian flash appeals by the UN and other international organizations to provide emergency relief aid to the Syrian people, it has become necessary to double the efforts to give more, as well as to mobilize the maximum amount possible of humanitarian aid and financial resources to fulfill the required needs. The state of Kuwait aspires that the conference will gather required support and generous contributions, and shall definitely be a crucial factor in alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people. Kuwait's government and people have not spared any effort since the eruption of the crisis in Syria to provide humanitarian aid to the brotherly Syrian people, though its official and popular institutions. It has also taken every measure to support them inside and outside Syria by Kuwaiti associations specialized in relief and medical work. The total amount of contributions provided is almost $60 million. His Highness Sheikh Sabah said the tragic conditions of our Syrian brothers suffer from strengthen our belief in the importance and the need to see tangible results of this international gathering. In Cairo on February 6th, His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah called on the international community, particularly the UN Security Council, to act effectively to end the non-stop bloodshed in Syria. His Highness the Amir said in his speech at the opening session of the 12th Summit of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation (OIC) in the Egyptian capital Cairo that the humanitarian tragedy in Syria is dragging on. The wounds of our brothers there is deepening, the number of killed, missing and displaced people swelling, and the destruction is increasing, and no solution seems to be reached in the near future despite the huge efforts on regional and international levels. His Highness Amir also highlighted the fruitful outcome of the International Conference of Syrian Donors to support the UN Security Council. The international community is facing a historic moment that requires unified effort to overcome hurdles and swift actions to meet the demands of the Syrian people, halt the bloodshed, and restore Syrian security and stability. His Highness Sheikh Sabah added that the conference had achieved its goal with donors' pledges exceeding the target of $1.5 billion, which demonstrates the international community's sympathy to the suffering. Later, a UN General Assembly meeting was held on the 26th of September 2013, which addressed many important events. Amongst them was Kuwait's celebration of its 50th anniversary as member of the global organization. For his part, Deputy Premier and Foreign Minister Sheikh Sabah Al-Khalid Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah said that other major events also included the participation of 131 heads of state and governments, as well as the accelerating pace of regional and international affairs. Sheikh Sabah delivered Kuwait's speech before the 68th UN General Assembly. Kuwait was keen in its speech to raise a bid to contribute to the implementation of UN plans to fight poverty and improve sustainable development beyond 2015. The Deputy Premier thanked UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon for his efforts in this regard. The speech also addressed the situation in Syria and hoped for a firm UN Security Council stance to stop the bloodshed among the Syrian people. The state of Kuwait also urged the international community to ease the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people, as it has done and will do what is required to help these Syrians, noting that the donors' conference held in Kuwait last January was aimed at easing the suffering of the Syrians. Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development, KFAED, is one of the main manifestations of the basic policy of Kuwait for contributing to the international development and relief efforts. The fund's initiatives in translating Kuwait's words and pledges into action expanded from the regional Arab scale to include other countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America. Meanwhile, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Al-Ahmad, the Arab League, lauded the efforts made by His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah in supporting the Syrian refugees. The regional representative of Al-Ahmad, Muhammad Al-Daily, said that Kuwait's role in supporting the Syrian refugees is highly appreciated, especially since Kuwait has taken on its shoulder hosting the donors' conference for the Syrians. He also expressed appreciations to Kuwait for honoring its pledging of giving $300 million in the 2013 donor conference, while other countries only paid 68% of the total pledges of $1.6 billion. In addition, he lauded Saudi Arabia and the UAE for their efforts in helping the displaced Syrians. He added that Kuwait continues its endeavours in helping the Syrians by hosting the second donor conference with the presence of chiefs from the UN, Arab League and other international humanitarian organisations. He also stated that 2013 has seen 1.7 million Syrians fleeing to neighbouring countries. As the new year approached, hopes were raised that the international community would strive harder to find a peaceful solution for this humanitarian crisis that has been taking place in Syria for some years now. For that reason, the Arab League is pinning greater hopes on the Geneva II Peace Conference on Syria to finding a permanent way out of this calamity. Al-Daily hoped that the amount of financial help the Al-Ahmad is apprising will be achieved in the second gathering of the donors' conference. Al-Ahmad is also appreciating the hospitality of Jordan and Lebanon for taking the Syrian refugees. The latest statistics showed that there are more than 820,000 Syrian refugees in Lebanon and more than 650,000 others in Jordan. These huge numbers of additional population have created extra burden on the two governments. Syrian ambassador to the EU Nabil al-Mullah expressed gratitude to the success of Kuwait's initiatives on Syria and said that the donor conference on Syria held in Kuwait on January 30th is considered the largest humanitarian pledging conference in the history of the United Nations. She explained how the humanitarian crisis started in Syria and Kuwait's role in providing humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. Amir noted that amid mounting concerns of the growing humanitarian crisis and the lack of funds to address the issue, the Secretary General of the United Nations called on Kuwait to host an international conference on humanitarian aid for Syria. She added that the Office of the Coordination of Human Affairs, OCHA, estimated that only 3% of this funding had already been met and that achieving the rest was imperative if services are to continue for the next 6 months. Al-Mullah went on to say that His Highness the Amir, who hosted the event, set the mood off to a good start by announcing a Kuwaiti donation of $300 million. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia announced their own $300 million donations, which effectively raised 60% of the targeted amount of aid between the three Gulf countries. The European Union, for its part, pledged €100 million, about $135 million, with individual member countries marking separate donations as well, while the United States offered $155 million. The conference in Kuwait City was attended by over 77 local, regional and international charity organizations, including private donors, in which a $183 million contribution was announced. Meanwhile, UNRWA's Commissioner General Filippo Grandi has praised the initiative and urged donors not to ignore the plight of some 525,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria. The gesture by His Highness Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah is considered a noble humanitarian issue which showed his concern for the Palestinian refugees in 2009 with a generous donation to UNRWA's emergency work in the Gaza Strip, where some 525,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria are suffering just as badly and urgently needed assistance. One of the most vulnerable communities in Syria are the Palestinian refugees, who have been seriously affected by the events on the ground as they rely on UNRWA for support. Several UNRWA schools in the country are currently acting as a refuge place for 9,000 people, while tens of thousands suffer under harsh conditions in neighboring countries. Some 20,000 people have fled to the overcrowded refugee camps in Lebanon. He said while all civilians in Syria are bearing the brunt of the violence, the situation of the Palestinians in Syria is exceptional. Many Palestinians in Syria have been killed, including 5 UNRWA staff members. Without funding, the organization will not even be able to continue helping the families sleeping on the floors of the schools. The agency had less than 5% of the funding needed to help the Palestinians in Syria. Upcoming summit. On December 19th, Assistant UN Secretary General and Regional Humanitarian Coordinator Nigel Fisher said that around 60 nations have been invited to a second donors conference for Syria in a bid to raise an unprecedented $6.5 billion in humanitarian aid. The United Nations appealed for a record $12.9 billion in global emergency aid, half of which is for victims of Syria's war, which have been killed, an estimated 126,000 people, and displaced millions more, both within the country and across its borders. The one-day event is to be held on January 15th in Kuwait, which hosted the first conference a year ago. Fisher said the funds will be used to aid around 13.4 million Syrians whom the United Nations estimates will be affected by the war by the end of 2014. The figure is higher than the original 10 million people announced by the United Nations 6 months ago. The United Nations will need $2.3 billion to support 9.3 million people inside Syria and $4.2 billion for the Syrian refugees, expected to nearly double to 4.1 million next year. The first donors conference in Kuwait last January saw participating nations pledge $1.5 billion, but only around 75% of the pledges were fulfilled. The aid is for food, which accounts for 1/5 of the sum, clean water, medical care and schooling, as well as to build refugee camps. On November 16, 2013, United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said that he depicts a gloomy picture of the upcoming humanitarian situation in Syria, urging member states to support the second Kuwait Donors Conference. Addressing the General Assembly, Ban said after an African tour and briefing on world affairs from climate change to political hotspots worldwide that the humanitarian response to the appeal for Syria is being hampered by a severe lack of funding. The Syrian people are still desperate for help today, and the situation in Syria remains the world's biggest threat to international peace and security. Ban added that the UN continues its efforts on 3 fronts. First, verifying the destruction of the country's chemical weapons. Second, providing life-saving humanitarian assistance. And third, achieving a political solution. He said that the joint mission of the United Nations and the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, now faces the most challenging phase of the operation, the destruction of weapons and chemicals by June 2014.
To ask to the media, you have a very important role, and I thank you very much for your concerns and your covering this crisis time. Through you, the people around the world can learn and can see what's happening here and all other places. So please remember that you have a very important role to help this crisis.
Ban stressed that he is grateful for member state pledges of logistical and other support and welcomes further contributions to the relevant trust funds of both organizations. The humanitarian situation in Syria continues to deteriorate rapidly and dramatically. Ban noted that more than 9 million people in Syria, nearly half of the country's population, need humanitarian assistance, expressing grave concern that the UN had been unable to only reach 2.5 million people trapped in besieged and hard-to-reach areas. The UN Secretary-General called on Damascus in particular to ease the severe constraints it has been imposed on humanitarian access and urged all parties and all those with influence over them to ensure the protection of civilians, the safe passage of medical personnel and supplies, and the unhindered delivery of aid. On the political front, Ban said ultimately the only way to end the shocking violence and suffering is through an inclusive and Syrian-led political process, while the UN continues to work hard to convene the Geneva II conference before the end of this year. For her part, UN Humanitarian Chief Valerie Amos said she has been notified of Kuwait's acceptance to host the second International Donor Conference for Syria next January and welcomed the Kuwaiti commitment to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. Chief Valerie Amos described the Syrian situation as one of the biggest crises in modern times and urged that the funding from this conference must be received immediately or it will be too late to deliver urgently needed supplies. The second Syrian Donors Conference is to lighten the suffering of the Syrian refugees who are suffering deteriorating conditions for the 3rd year now. The Syrian refugees, along with a large number of international organizations, pin high hopes on the upcoming conference, and the efforts is of greater importance in view of the current climate and weather conditions in the region. President of Jordan's National Red Crescent Society, Dr. Mohammed Al-Hadid, praised the humanitarian initiative of the Kuwaiti leadership and people of hosting the second Syrian Donors Conference. He also hailed Kuwait's continuous support to all humanitarian gestures towards the Syrian refugees. He expressed hope that this conference will be as successful as the first one, which raised much more than anticipated. For his part, Foreign Relations and Finance official of the Kuwaiti support to the Coordination Regional Office for Syrian Refugees for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, Ma'moon Mohsen, stressed on the importance of such conferences hosted by Kuwait, which is playing a pioneering role in the humanitarian work field. He particularly recalled Kuwait's remarkable support of the UN Regional Plan for Humanitarian Aid for the Syrian refugees valued at $6.5 million. This conference convenes as the humanitarian situation in Syria deteriorates further and further due to the continued conflict, which is causing soaring number of people who are internally displaced, as well as pushing up the numbers of refugees in neighboring countries, namely Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey and Iraq. The number of Syrian refugees in neighboring countries is expected to go up from 2.3 million refugees in 2013 to around 4.1 million refugees in 2014. Head of the Wounded Project at Al Jazeera Hospital in Jordan, Dr. Badriya Sheikh Al-Basatiya, hailed Kuwaiti's support of Syrian refugees. She pointed out that this project is 99.9% sponsored by Kuwait. She joined other officials in stressing the importance of the second Syrian Donors Conference at a time of dire need. Kuwaiti relief efforts in support of Syrian refugees in Jordan contributed in providing medical treatment to more than 6,000 injured Syrians. As for future efforts, she called for more coordination between the donor countries and civil society institutions and urged those in the field to benefit from the Kuwaiti experience in charity work, in which goes over 60 years back. Kuwaiti Ambassador to Jordan, Dr. Hamad Daej, for his part, said this conference is held for the second time upon the instructions of His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah, to draw the attention of the international community to the suffering of the Syrian people and rally global support for them. The UN estimates that the number of Syrians who fled violence in their homeland to neighboring countries since the outbreak of the crisis in March 2011 is around 2.3 million people. Circumstances have worsened further with the onset of harsh winter weather. International aid agencies said that they have been struggling to provide medical aid to the sick and wounded because of fierce fighting between the forces of President Bashar al-Assad and the rebels. International Rescue Committee IRC President David Miliband said his organization's latest survey showed that starvation is threatening the Syrian population. He called the Syrian conflict the defining humanitarian crisis of the century so far. The IRC president added that in a situation where the civilians are targeted by snipers or bombs, where doctors are targeted because they've treated the wrong side, and where aid workers are unable to cross the conflict lines because of the norms of war are not being followed and international humanitarian laws being broken, nothing is ever enough. Chairman of the Syrian National Coalition (SNC), Ahmad Al-Jarba, highly appreciated the support offered by the GCC states, particularly Kuwait, to the Syrian people who suffer a large scale of humanitarian tragedy. Al-Jarba expressed deep gratitude to the state of Kuwait for hosting him, saying he was honored with the meetings he held with His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Jabir Al-Sabah, His Highness Sheikh Jabir Mubarak Al-Hamad Al-Sabah, the Prime Minister, and Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Sabah Al-Khalid Al-Hamad Al-Sabah. Underscoring the significance of his mission in Kuwait, he said the visit came at a crucial timing, only 2 days ahead of the GCC summit, adding that he explained to the top leaders of current political situation and humanitarian conditions in Syria. Al-Jarba said that Kuwaiti leaders would relay this picture to their GCC counterparts at the summit, where the Syrian cause would be a core topic in the discussions. Praising Kuwait's major role in supporting the Syrian refugees, he noted its hosting of the International Donors Conference for Syria in January. His Highness the Amir had played a major role in this respect. Al-Jarba also said that up to 7 million Syrians have become relocated, homeless or refugees outside the country. In Syria, the people are experiencing grave tragedy, and most of them have lost their homes and jobs, and the situation is literally catastrophic. Al-Jarba expressed confidence that the second donors conference would be crowned with success, noting that the forthcoming convention would be quite necessary in shadow of the mounting catastrophes in Syria. Al-Jarba expressed that he, along with the Syrian opposition leaders, were pinning high hopes on the GCC summit for further support for the Syrian cause. He reiterated that the coalition would take part in the Geneva II Conciliation Conference due at the end of January, but on the basis of the basic principle of the Syrian revolution. Al-Jarba explains that the opposition had presented several requests at the recent London meeting that grouped foreign ministers of allied states, adding that he believes the meeting will pave the way to ensure success of the Geneva II conference. He indicated that the opposition had also requested action to resolve the plight of thousands of Syrians held in prisons, and that President Bashar al-Assad should not have any role in the transitional phase. Speaking in regard to the current actions by the coalition, he noted that the movement had pressed for the prosecution of al-Assad and his aides by the International Criminal Court for continuously spilling blood in Syria since more than 2.5 years ago. Al-Jarba said the coalition had informed the UN about the use of chemical arms in Al-Naq on the northern outskirts of Damascus, in addition to various other atrocities where the regime set people afire. The regime is currently trying to gain more grounds in the ongoing fight to strengthen its status ahead of the Geneva II talks. Al-Jarba acknowledged that the coalition is not on good terms with some other opposition groups, but stressed that its current main objective is fighting the regime. For his part, Jordan's ambassador to the UN, Prince Zaid Al Hussein, expressed hope his government will get a great deal of support from the Kuwaiti II donor conference for the Syrian refugees who represent an economic burden on the country. He recalled that his government has sent a letter to the UN Security Council last year inviting the members to visit Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, but the Council has not responded yet. He said that he will reopen this issue soon, now that Jordan is a Council non-permanent member, expressing hope that the members will visit the camp in the near future. On the events occurring in Syria and elsewhere, he said that what is happening in the region is of great concern to everybody, and there must be a better way of settling problems. On November 15th, relief supplies granted by Kuwait have been distributed to 1,000 Syrian families taking up refuge in Lebanon, according to a local philanthropic association. The Public Relations Director of the Lebanese Zakat and Charities House, Abdallah Al-Bosh, said that materials included food, mattresses and some items used in the winter season. Al-Bosh praised Kuwait, namely the charitable organizations, for aiding hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, where 800,000 Syrian refugees have settled, some in dire conditions. Supplies given to Syrians in the northern city of Tripoli were also provided by the Kuwaiti International Islamic Charitable Organization IICO. On December 15th, the UN Humanitarian Envoy Abdullah Al-Martouk said that about 73% of pledges announced in the first Syrian Donors Conference held in Kuwait last January had been fulfilled. Al-Martouk, also chairman of the Kuwaiti-based International Islamic Charity Organization and advisor at the Amir Ridwan, denied reports that the administrative costs consumed the bulk of the aid. He stated that administrative costs hover between 3 to 7% of the total aid, stressing that 7% threshold is binding and firmly applied in all international organizations. He pointed out that UN agencies are getting ready to participate in the second Syria Donors Conference. He recalled His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah's initiative to host the first international conference of Syrian donors in January 2013, which raised $1.5 billion in aid pledges, including $300 million from Kuwait. He spoke highly about the huge efforts exerted by the Kuwaiti government and non-government organizations to offer all help to desperate Syrian refugees. The second phase of the food aid project to Syrian refugees in the Lebanese territories took place on December 23rd, with the Kuwaiti-based International Islamic Charity Organization providing food assistance to 1,200 Syrian refugee families located in Tripoli and other northern cities. Lebanon's Zakat and Charity House, in charge of distributing the aid to the displaced people, lauded in a statement Kuwait's role in supporting the Syrian people. The statement noted that the IICO efforts and big relief projects helped reduce the suffering of the displaced in various fields, expressing appreciation to Kuwait's leadership, government and people. Kuwait Red Crescent Society announced delivering further aid to the Syrian refugees in northern Lebanon as part of the ongoing efforts to reduce their suffering and hardships. The Society envoy in Lebanon, Dr. Musa'ad Al-Anizi, said that volunteers distributed the material assistance, including mattresses and blankets, to 1,000 Syrians in a mountainous district of Al-Daniya to help them cope with cold weather. Kuwait's various charity and public institutes are considered one of the prominent aid contributors to Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Aid also reached Jordan on December 25th after Kuwait Red Crescent Society KRCS sent 5 trucks loaded with blankets, clothes and wheelchairs to the Syrian refugees. The aid project comes in line with several KRCS projects within the framework of a Kuwaiti humanitarian activity that is continuing since the outbreak of the Syrian crisis 3 years ago. The KRCS welcomed donations by all nationals and said that the society would send its correspondence over to those who could not donate in person. The unrest in Syria has been mounting since March 2011, leading to the displacement of tens of thousands of civilians. As of January 2012, more than 78,000 people are estimated to have fled to neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey and Iraq, putting an increasing strain on the governments and hosting communities. In response, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners issued an appeal in March 2012 for $84 million to support Syrian refugees. The Syria Regional Response Plan outlines current and future needs of some 100,000 Syrian refugees over 6 months. Led by UNHCR, the plan is the result of a coordinated effort between 7 UN agencies, 27 national and international NGOs and partners and host governments. The Regional Response Plan will be revised at the end of June 2012. In Jordan, some 21,400 Syrians have registered with UNHCR as of June 2012. This figure is expected to increase as UNHCR and partners expanded their outreach efforts and levels of assistance to these Syrians. The Jordanian government and UNHCR believe that there are tens of thousands of vulnerable Syrians in their country. Many refugees have arrived with limited means to cover basic needs, and those who could at first rely on savings or support from host families are now increasingly in need of assistance. In Lebanon, many refugees are in a dangerous situation with little or no financial resources. UNHCR and partners are working with the government, local authorities and international and national partners to assist more than 27,500 Syrians. More than half of them, 17,000, have been registered in the north. UNHCR and partners are assisting 3,000 Syrian refugees in Tripoli and 7,500 in Bahrain, who are pending registration. In Turkey, some 24,300 Syrians are registered with the government. The government has assumed responsibility for assisting, sheltering and protecting the refugees in camps, with UNHCR providing technical support as well as thousands of tents and blankets. In addition, UNHCR is registering and assisting refugees who were previously hosted in Syria. Iraq has recently seen a growing number of Syrians arriving. As of June, some 4,400 had been registered, with a further 425 awaiting registration. Our current partners have started assisting refugees in close cooperation with the authorities.